Good morning. My name's Russ Weninger. I'm a lawyer with Weninger Jong. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So this is the second YouTube live stream webinar on COVID-19 and immigration. Today I'm going to be talking about humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications and temporary resident permit applications. I'm also going to be answering questions at the end of this presentation, and the questions aren't going to be limited to humanitarian applications and temporary resident permit applications. They can be questions about Canadian immigration law and in general. Before I get going, I'd like to give a special thanks to the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society. They helped promote the initial webinar and kind of gave me the idea for the webinar. So a special shout out to CCIS. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Sunny Lou JD, who's my articling student, who's also producing this webinar behind the scenes. She's compiling questions, she's checking audio, she's helping me with the back-end tech for the YouTube stream. So thanks very much, Sunny, for that. I want to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to be, for the most part anyways, saving questions towards the end. Maybe at some point I'll glance at questions throughout the presentation, but I suspect I'm going to save everything towards the end. So if I don't get to your question right away, don't worry, I'm going to try to get to them at the end. There is the possibility, though, that I won't get to your question if a lot of people are asking questions. But I'll do my best to answer as many questions as possible. Today I won't be discussing firm services or fees, so don't bother to ask any questions about that. This is not meant to be a promotional video for the Weninger Jong law firm. It's meant to provide information to the viewers that may be able to assist them in any immigration applications. I'm not going to be discussing any other areas of law aside from Canadian immigration law. So if you have employment law issues or an issue with your landlord or something like that, I'm not going to deal with that at all. I'm only going to be talking about immigration law issues today. One thing to note, I'm going to be putting this presentation up on YouTube. So if for any reason the presentation gets cut out, there are technical issues, maybe I lose my internet connection, don't worry, I'm going to be putting it on YouTube later on. Likewise, if you have to leave for any reason, don't worry, you can access the information in the live stream later on YouTube. So a little bit about me. My name's Russ Weninger. I'm the co-founder or a co-founder of the Weninger Jong law firm. My primary practice areas are in Canadian immigration law and in wills and estates. I really enjoy listening to piano music, playing the piano. I'm classically trained. I'm a little bit rusty at the moment, haven't had the opportunity to practice as much as I'd like lately, but music is something that brings me great joy. And at the moment, or actually it's been a multi-year work in progress, I'm trying to learn Japanese. I've got a Japanese partner, and my in-laws all live in Japan, and so that's something I'm trying to do eventually is learn basic conversational Japanese. So this is an overview of the presentation. What I'm going to talk about today first of all, I'm going to mention a couple of updates since last week. Then I'm going to discuss a little bit about the uses of humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications and temporary resident permit applications. Then I'm going to discuss what to include in those applications. And I'm going to provide a few resources that people might want to use if they're considering doing those applications. And then I'm going to open things up to questions. So let's start with some updates. Last week, I got a number of questions about the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program, whether it would keep going as, whether they'd keep processing the applications as they've done in the past, whether it would be business as usual, whether they'd make any special accommodations for people. And I wasn't really sure, and I still can't really answer any of that definitively. I don't know how the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program is going to behave going forward. It might be drastically different. It might be they might just try to approve as many applications as possible. They might just try to reject as many applications as possible. I hope that's not the case, but that might be the case. They may discontinue their program streams. It's really hard to say, and we haven't been provided with any clarity from AINP on any of those issues. They've been noticeably silent on those issues. But anecdotally, the other day, and I won't go into any real details about this, but I was contacted by someone, and I want to protect this person's privacy, so I won't reveal personal details, but I was contacted by someone who received a rejection on an AINP application. In fact, the person had already received a certificate of nomination from AINP even a couple of years ago, and this person was having their application processed by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. So it was at the federal stage for processing, and AINP noticed a problem with the application. It was a real technicality. It wasn't, in my mind, it wasn't something that should have disqualified the person from having their nomination continue. It was kind of a minor thing, and it was a nitpicky thing, but AINP went out of its way to contact Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada about this particular person, and to withdraw the nomination. And so then IRCC ended up rejecting the person's application. Now, this might be an isolated incident, but if this is a reflection of how AINP officers are going to be behaving going forward, I don't take this to be a good sign. I take this to be a sign that you can't expect AINP to have your back during this time. And that's really unfortunate. But for years now, AINP has kind of been a mixed bag in terms of how they've treated applicants. And I really don't think that you can count on them during this COVID-19 pandemic for much sympathy. Let me put it that way. So don't expect a lot from them. And if you do submit an application, make sure you dot the I's and cross the T's, and make sure you continue to comply with all the requirements up until the time you get your permanent residence, because AINP tends to be very by the book, and you won't, or at least historically, you couldn't really expect a lot of flexibility from them. And going forward, I don't think you'll be able to expect a lot of flexibility from them. Another update I'd like to report, this is actually good news. According to, I believe it was, I think I saw this on Twitter from immigration lawyer Ravi Jain. Someone will hopefully correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I believe it was from Ravi Jain, that the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, is not going to be considered social assistance for sponsorship purposes. So ordinarily, when someone submits a sponsorship application, for example, spousal sponsorship, where one spouse sponsors the other spouse, the sponsor has to make sure that they're not on social assistance at any point during the sponsorship application. And if they do go on social assistance, they run the risk of having the sponsorship application rejected. So then the live issue was, by the way, employment insurance is also not considered social assistance. And last week when I did the first webinar, I mentioned that employment insurance wouldn't be considered social assistance, but I wasn't sure about CERB, whether it would be considered social assistance. So now it appears that CERB won't be treated as social assistance, which is good news for anyone who's a party to a sponsorship application of any kind, whether it's a spousal sponsorship, a common law sponsorship, a sponsorship of a child, a sponsorship of a parent, or of some other family member. The good news is that it appears as if CERB will not be considered social assistance. I'll try to, by the next webinar, see if I can find some corroboration of that. But for the time being, it appears as if CERB won't be considered social assistance. Now, before I get into the kind of the main substance of the talk today, I want to go over some general strategies that I think will be beneficial to people who are looking at submitting applications during this period of time. I think for virtually any application that a person's submitting right now, whether it's a humanitarian application or whether it's a routine work permit application or whether even it's an express entry application, I think it's not a bad idea to note the special humanitarian circumstances that are applicable at this point in time, and those humanitarian circumstances may be very personal to you, or they may be of broader applicability to the general population, but these are very special times. So I think it's worth noting that in any application that you're submitting. I also think for any application that a person's submitting that it's important to demonstrate that you're a good, smart, hardworking person, that you're going to contribute in some meaningful way to Canadian society. I think it's important to convey that message to any immigration officer you're sending an application off to, because immigration officers are human, and human beings like to think that they're making the right decision, that the outcome of their decision will be will lead to the greater good. And So if you can help convince an immigration officer that that approving your application will be a net benefit to Canadian society, I think that's very, very, very helpful, especially now. The other thing, I think this should almost go without saying, but I think it's important to say it, is that you really have to make sure that you dot your I's and cross your T's on any application that you're submitting right now. That's always applicable, but it's especially applicable now because the stakes are very, very, very high. You might not have the opportunity to do a do-over if you screw something up. So it's very important to get things right the first time. And the way you get things right is by putting your best effort into any application that you're submitting. Half measures aren't appropriate at this point in time. You have to go all out and provide your best quality application for submission. So we're going to be considering a couple of different things today. One is temporary resident permits. So those are kind of like humanitarian applications, but they're on a temporary basis. So a temporary resident permit is something that can give someone temporary status, even though they might not otherwise qualify for temporary status. And usually the justification, or I shouldn't say usually, but often the justification for the granting of a temporary resident permit is some humanitarian factor. So temporary resident permits are essentially for people who have a compelling reason or compelling reasons to remain temporarily in Canada. However, there are some other options that may be available to people. So, for example, a person might meet the requirements for a postgraduate work permit and not even need to submit a temporary resident permit application. A person might also qualify for some other type of open work permit, such as a spousal open work permit. Maybe the spouse is a skilled worker, or maybe the spouse is a study permit holder, an international student. Or maybe the person has already submitted an immigration application that's being processed, and an application for permanent residence, and so they can qualify for a bridging work permit of some sort. So sometimes other options are available. Sometimes a person might even qualify for an employer-specific work permit. Maybe the employer has, for example, a labor market impact assessment, an LMIA that allows them to hire a foreign worker. Or maybe the person can qualify under something like a NAFTA work permit or some other type of international trade agreement based work permit or something like that. A person might also qualify for a study permit. Maybe they're currently studying, and study permits usually allow a person to work part-time during the period of studies, so up to 20 hours a week, and then the person can also work full-time during semester breaks, for example. Also, maybe a person doesn't have to apply for a temporary resident permit because they would qualify for a normal visitor extension. Maybe they have plenty of money and they don't have to work. They can live off of their savings and continue to stay here as a visitor during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it might be the case that a visitor extension is good enough and that a temporary resident permit isn't required. Now, in terms of permanent options for permanent residents, what's very similar to a temporary resident permit is what's called an H&C application, or an application under humanitarian and compassionate grounds. And so this is an option for some people who might not have any other viable options for immigration. But then the issue is, are there other viable options? So some options might be express entry, for example. If the person has skilled work experience, especially if they've worked in Canada, they have a high level of English or French language proficiency, so they've got skilled work experience, they've got a good level of education, maybe the education or work experience happened in Canada. Express entry candidates, the ones that get approved, they tend to be, kind of somewhere between their 20s and early 40s. So if they're young, they're well educated, they have good work experience, some connection, either educational or work related to Canada. Those sorts of people might qualify under express entry. And if they do qualify under express entry, and they create an express entry profile, and the points are quite high on the profile, then express entry might be a good option, and maybe the person doesn't even have to worry about an H&C application. I was talking about the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program a little earlier. That is theoretically an option for people. So if you are currently working in Alberta and you meet the requirements of the Alberta Opportunity Stream, for example, you might consider applying under AINP. As far as I know, those applications continue to be processed. As far as I know, they're still accepting those applications. That can change, so anything I tell you today, take with a grain of salt. Immigration programs may end up being paused or discontinued. Immigration policies may change, at a moment's notice. Right now, it's possible that maybe Prime Minister Trudeau or some other government minister is announcing some government policy that completely changes what I'm saying right now. But the information I'm providing today is based on what I believe to be the case at this point in time. And so as far as I know, the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program is still up and running, and is still a potential option for permanent residence for people. And the nice thing about express entry and the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program is if you get accepted into either program, for example, if you get an invitation to apply under express entry and you submit your application, or if you apply to the Alberta Immigrant Nominee Program and you receive your nomination certificate, then you're eligible to apply for a postgraduate work permit, a bridging work permit. And in most cases anyways, if you're not currently out of status, if you're within a few months of your work permit expiring, you're eligible to apply for that bridging work permit. So that's the good news about qualifying under those types of programs, and that's one of the reasons why anyone who's thinking about applying for permanent residence shouldn't immediately jump into an H&C application. They should consider whether or not they qualify under express entry or AINP. Currently, there are some pilot programs available. There's the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program. There's a program for northern and rural communities. I don't think people should get their hopes up with those sorts of programs. I think those programs are essentially going to be dormant for the next several months or even the next couple of years. So don't get your hopes up when it comes to the pilot programs. If you don't have any other options, they might be worth looking into. There might be some employers, some places where they're still looking for people and where people might still have opportunities under the pilot programs, but the vast majority of people won't have real viable options under those pilot programs, which are marginally applicable at best for immigration to Canada. Another option that some people might face, or that some people might have, is the option to make a refugee claim. I've been getting a lot of inquiries about this lately, and most of the inquiries have been from people who are outside of Canada, and they want to come to Canada to make an in-Canada refugee claim. And I point out to those people, look, you can't really make an in-Canada refugee claim unless you can get to Canada, and currently almost everyone is barred from coming to Canada. So you're not even going to be able to get on a plane to come to Canada. And for that matter, even if you make it to the U.S. somehow, if you drive to the border and you make a refugee claim, they're just going to send you right back. So unless you're currently in Canada, a refugee claim isn't really a viable option. In some cases, people are being sponsored as refugees, so people might be in refugee camps and recognized as refugees by the UNHCR, for example. And some Canadians and some organizations in Canada and even the government of Canada is sponsoring some refugees from overseas, and I believe that's continuing on. But to make a refugee claim, to kind of proactively go and request refugee status in Canada, you can only really do that if you're in Canada. Now, when a person is thinking about doing a refugee claim, I think an important question to ask is it a desperation move? Are they doing it just to get immigration status in Canada? For example, sometimes people will do refugee claims just to get a work permit, because one of the nice things about submitting a refugee claim is that you'll get a work permit fairly quickly. And so sometimes people use a refugee claim as a tactic for getting a work permit. But if that's the basis, if that's the motivation for the refugee claim, I think that's a desperation move. One thing to note is that if you submit a refugee claim at the moment, you probably aren't going to have a hearing for some time. As far as I'm aware, the Refugee Protection Division currently isn't having any in-person hearings in Canada, and maybe some hearings will start to be happening by video conference down the road, but at least for the time being, at least it's my understanding that hearings aren't really happening. So there's likely to be a backlog. If you're doing a refugee claim, you'll likely have to wait for some time for your hearing, several months, maybe even 1 or 2 years. That could be the wait to get to a hearing. And for some people, that might be good news. If they have a fairly weak claim, maybe what they're really trying to do is just get the work permit. By the way, that's not something I advocate as a strategy, but for some people who are employing that strategy, they may, in fact, find some benefit from the processing delays, or from the I shouldn't say the processing delays, but the current postponement of hearings. Now, so there may be a delay, and in the meantime, the person will have status as a worker and be allowed to work, assuming they can actually find a job. But if that's the case, that they are able to find a job, then they'll be able to work in Canada for the time being. However, at the end of the day, if you're not a good candidate for a refugee claim, you're kind of, for short-term gain, you're kind of screwing yourself over for the long run. If a refugee claim is ultimately rejected, the person typically has to leave Canada. There's typically a removal order issued, and Canada Border Services usually acts quite promptly in removing failed refugee claimants from Canada. Now, going forward, there might be a backlog of removals as well, and so failed refugee claimants may end up staying for several months, or even a couple of years in Canada after their claims have failed, just because Canada Border Services is finding it difficult to round these people up and remove them. But that being said, if your claim fails, you're likely going to be out of immigration options. There might be some things you can try, such as a humanitarian application, which we'll get to in a moment. But for failed refugee claimants, there are even certain restrictions on applying under humanitarian and compassionate grounds, and in many cases, people have to wait a full year before they after a failed refugee claim, before they can submit an application under humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So I would really think long and hard about doing a refugee claim if the claim is weak at best. It may not be a good idea. And I know sometimes people they make the choices they make because they have to put food on the table, and because the immediate circumstances are so desperate that they're willing to sacrifice their long-term immigration prospects in order to, not starve to death in the here and now. But if you can use some other strategy for acquiring permanent residence or temporary residence, and at best you have a weak refugee claim, I think you should seriously consider looking at other alternatives. And those other alternatives are the ones being presented today: temporary resident permits and humanitarian applications. So another theoretical option for some people will be spousal sponsorships. So if you're married to a Canadian, or or a permanent resident, or you're in a common law relationship with a Canadian or permanent resident, so in other words, you've lived with that person for at least a year, you might qualify for spousal sponsorship. Now, some things that can throw a wrinkle in spousal sponsorships are, for example, if the sponsor loses their job, if the sponsor dies, or if the relationship breaks down. So I think with any type of spousal sponsorship application, even if you're not submitting a formal humanitarian application, I think you should be making humanitarian arguments if you're the applicant in that type of application, and you should directly reference humanitarian relief and request that relief in the event that, for whatever reason, your sponsor is disqualified from being a sponsor, or if for some reason you're found to be inadmissible to Canada. So, for example, sometimes in a spousal sponsorship application, a person might have the person who's applying for permanent residence might have a minor criminal record, and pleading humanitarian relief can sometimes overcome that type of criminal inadmissibility. Now, if you are doing a humanitarian application, one thing you'll want to reference in your application somewhere is Section 25 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. So Section 25, Sub 1 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act is the basis for making a humanitarian and compassionate request to the government. And it can be used to cover, overcome all sorts of different defects with an application, problems with criminal or medical inadmissibility in many cases, the fact that a person might otherwise fail to meet certain application requirements. A humanitarian request can potentially overcome a lot of problems with an application. Certain things can't go through a humanitarian or through Section 25. So, for example, if someone's a war criminal, they've committed serious crimes against humanity, genocide, things like that, they're not. This particular section isn't going to be applicable to them. They're not going to qualify for H&C considerations. Now, by the way, one thing I should mention is that for many practical purposes, a temporary resident permit and a humanitarian and compassionate grounds application, they rely on the same types of information. And I'm not talking about the immigration forms. The immigration forms, the set government forms that you have to fill out when you submit one of these applications, those are like 10% of the application. So those are they're necessary. They're very minimal requirements. Those are really just a small piece of what's needed for one of those applications to succeed. What a temporary resident permit requires and what an H&C application requires is that applicants provide all sorts of supporting evidence for their applications. And such supporting evidence can include, for example, evidence of hardship that they would face if the application weren't approved, or evidence of establishment in Canada if they happen to be currently living in Canada, for example, or if they have friends or relatives in Canada. They could also provide evidence of how a child might be affected by the outcome of the application. And that's a very important consideration if, in fact, a child is affected by the outcome of a humanitarian application or a temporary resident permit application. That's something worth noting and highlighting. Because it's a very important consideration, especially in an H&C application. Now, this is not meant to be exhaustive, but in terms of providing information, evidence about hardship in an application, there are some different things you might want to provide evidence on. So, for example, people oftentimes provide evidence of economic hardship when they're doing an application. So they'll show that in Canada they're currently gainfully employed and making enough money to support their family and maybe even an extended family back home. But if they are forced to leave Canada, then they'll face economic hardship in their own country. Maybe they won't be able to find a job. Maybe the economy is bad there. Maybe there's a lot of discrimination in the labor market towards certain types of people, for example. So the person might face economic hardship if they have to go back to their home country. They might also face medical hardship. Maybe the person has a medical condition that can only be properly treated in Canada, and if they have to go back to their home country, then their health will be jeopardized, or someone else's health will be jeopardized. Maybe a family member's health will be jeopardized. In this era of COVID-19, maybe they'd be returning to a country where COVID-19 is running rampant. People are dying, in large numbers, and bodies are being dumped in the street because they have nowhere else to store them, for example. So if you have any evidence of medical hardship that would be applicable to you or applicable to your family, that sort of evidence is worth including in a humanitarian application. And that type of evidence oftentimes includes things like doctor's notes, letters from doctors, psychologists. It can also include country condition information about the healthcare system in a particular country. So medical evidence about hardship that can be an important part of a humanitarian application or a temporary resident permit application. Another type of hardship is political hardship. So maybe the person is a political dissident in their home country. They have political views that are not appreciated by the powers that be in their home country. And if they go back to their home country, maybe they would face discrimination, maybe even something like persecution. Maybe they'd find it really difficult to get along with others in their home country because of their political views. Maybe they're very progressive and they're from a very conservative society, for example. So this could be an example of political hardship that someone might face if they were forced to return to their home country. There could also be cultural hardships that a person might face. For example, a person might be part of a cultural minority. They might be someone who they have certain opportunities in Canada to express their culture, but they don't if they're forced to go back to their home country. So if that applies to you, that's worth highlighting in an H&C or in a TRP application. Sometimes the hardship relates to education. So maybe there are lost opportunities either for the applicant or for a family member of the applicant if the applicant is forced to return to their home country. Maybe the educational system in their home country is very poor. maybe the opportunities for study in their home country just aren't there, but they are in Canada. In some cases, people in Canada are actually funding the education of relatives overseas, and if they're forced to return to their home country, then they'll lose their job, they'll lose their economic ability to support the education of family members overseas. So the hardship could be the hardship faced by people overseas who aren't going to be able to attend school because their education will no longer be paid for example. Another thing hardship can include is separation from family or friends. So if you're forced to leave Canada and return to your home country, maybe you even have Canadian relatives, a Canadian spouse, a Canadian child, or maybe your parents or siblings live in Canada. Maybe you have a lot of friends here. Maybe you're not yet married or in a common law relationship, but you have a a very serious relationship, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and you're very close to that person, and you want to preserve that relationship, and being separated from that person will cause you hardship. So that can be an example of hardship due to separation. So hardship is one thing that you should try to provide evidence on if you're doing a humanitarian application or if you're doing a temporary resident permit application. Another thing you should talk about is your degree of establishment in Canada. So, for example, you could talk about the amount of time you've spent in Canada. And usually the more the better. So, if you've spent 5 years in Canada, that's better than if you've only spent 6 months in Canada. If you've spent 10 years in Canada, that's even better than if you've just spent 5 years in Canada. That being said, sometimes people will live without status in Canada for years and years and years, and usually whichever immigration officer is reviewing the application, they usually don't give a lot of credit to people for time that's been spent here in Canada without valid status. So that's something to be aware of, is that usually when people are submitting these applications, if they're going to get quote unquote points for establishment in Canada, it's usually time in Canada where they had valid status. That's really what's relevant, at least from the perspective of most immigration officers, and there's case law on that as well. So time spent in Canada is a consideration. What you've done while you're here in Canada, that's very important too. So whether it's working, studying, sometimes people will be starting up a business here. Sometimes people will be doing a lot of volunteer work while they're here. That can be very important in terms of showing establishment in Canada. As I mentioned earlier, do you have family or friends in Canada? If you do, that indicates establishment in Canada. If you have a second cousin, twice removed or something like that, then maybe that person lives on the other side of the country. Maybe that's not a very strong connection in terms of establishment in Canada. But if your spouse lives here, or if your children live here, or other close family members live here, then that can be very important. Work performed in Canada, work performed legally in Canada, and the paying of taxes in Canada is also very important in terms of showing establishment. property ownership. So, maybe you lived here so long that you actually bought a house. Or, even if you don't have a house, you've been, paying rent in Canada for years and years and contributing to the economy that way. Maybe you've purchased a vehicle. You've bought a lot of furniture. So sometimes proof of property ownership or of contributing to the economy through purchasing things, that could potentially be useful as well in terms of showing establishment in Canada. Contributions to the community are potentially huge in terms of establishment. So if you're the type of person who does volunteer or charitable work or participates in community groups, or if you go to the church regularly, or the mosque, or a synagogue, or temple, or so you're active in a religious community, or you can provide evidence that you're tremendously helpful to friends and family who are here in Canada. Those sorts of things can demonstrate establishment in Canadian society. So we've talked about hardship. We've talked about establishment in Canada. Another important bit of evidence, if it's applicable, for a temporary resident permit or for an agency application, is evidence about the best interests of a child. So, for immigration purposes, a child is someone who's under the age of 18. Now, in some cases, maybe the applicant, the person who's applying for permanent resident, maybe that person is a child. So if you are under the age of 18, then your best interests are quite relevant in a humanitarian application. But if you're not a child, but you have some sort of connection to children, and you being removed from Canada or being required to go back to your home country, if that would negatively affect a child, then that's an important consideration. And children don't necessarily have to be your children. They can be other relatives, such as nieces or nephews. They could be just children you happen to know or are connected to in some way. So maybe you're babysitting some kids. Maybe you're the coach of a youth soccer team. Maybe you teach piano lessons to children. There could be all sorts of different ways that a person might be connected to children. Maybe you're providing financial support to children in different ways, and that might be direct support or indirect support. So maybe you're supporting the parents of some children. One thing that's important to note is the children don't have to be Canadian children, so they don't have to be Canadian citizens or permanent residents. They don't even have to have valid status in Canada. They don't even have to be in Canada. So they could be children who would be negatively affected if you were required to leave Canada, who are living in your home country. Maybe they're children that you're financially supporting with your income in Canada, and if you were required to leave, then that support would dry up. So we've discussed kind of three general types of evidence that should be provided. So evidence of hardship, evidence of establishment in Canada, and if applicable, evidence related to the best interests of children or a child. Now, there are many different things that can be included as evidence in a humanitarian application or in a temporary resident permit application. One example of evidence is old immigration documents. So if you want to show establishment in Canada, that you've been here legally, that you've worked legally, you'll want to provide copies of your own or of your old work permits, study permits, things like that. You'll typically, if you want to show that you've got a relationship with someone, or that you're either married to someone or you're related to someone in some way, it can sometimes be helpful to provide documents that corroborate some type of family relationship, such as marriage documents or birth certificates or things like that. In terms of showing your financial circumstances or the financial circumstances of someone else, oftentimes it's helpful to provide financial records, or things like leases or property ownership documents or tax documents. If you've been working in Canada and paying taxes in Canada, it's very helpful to provide things like your T4s and notices of assessment from Canada Revenue Agency to show that you've been, contributing to the Canadian tax base over a period of time. What's oftentimes quite helpful if it's done properly is things like letters from friends and family. The letters should be signed, and they should include a copy of the person's ID, like a driver's license or passport or national identity card or something like that. But getting letters from friends and family can be extremely helpful in a humanitarian application. Country condition documents are also very important in any type of humanitarian application, any type of temporary resident permit application. Things like journalist articles about your home country, academic articles, publications from government organizations, or respected non-governmental organizations. Those sorts of documents, if they talk about the economic conditions in your home country, or maybe discrimination in your home country, or the crime rate or lack of protection in your home country, or the lack of a good educational system or a good healthcare system, those sorts of documents can be extremely helpful, provided they're credible documents, and provided they're fairly current. If they're 20 years old or something like that, they might not be that valuable. But if they're from the last couple of years, and they appear to be from a credible source, and they have information that demonstrates that conditions in your home country might not be the best, those documents can be helpful. Medical documents, so anything showing that you or someone who's associated with your application in some way, that they have a health problem, those can be helpful. So letters from doctors, other documents corroborating a medical condition, those can be helpful. Educational documents, so documents that show that you're attending school, or that you've graduated from school, or that you're pursuing a particular educational field. those sorts of things can be helpful. Educational documents related to other relatives can be helpful too. Sometimes, if a family's applying, so it's mom and dad and the kids, it might be helpful to throw in, school report cards from the kids or letters from the kids' teachers, things like that. If you have documents showing that a relative that's overseas is going to a private school that you're funding or a university that you're funding or something like that, showing that you're paying the tuition, tuition documents from the school, that can be very helpful. Proof of work experience can be helpful. So your resume, that's not a bad idea to include in an application, but letters from your employers, for example, T4s, things like that, they can be tremendously helpful in providing proof of work experience. As a general rule, immigration officers tend to favor evidence that's in certain forms, and one type of evidence that's favored is affidavit evidence, and the reason for that is because the evidence is sworn. So the person who's doing the affidavit is swearing under oath, under penalty of perjury if they're lying, that they're telling the truth, and that they're providing accurate information. So especially for the principal applicant in a temporary resident permit or in a humanitarian compassionate grounds application, it's oftentimes a good idea to provide some context about the person's situation in affidavit format. You can even get affidavits from people who are living overseas, although with this COVID-19 pandemic making it difficult for people to, meet face to face with lawyers and notaries and people like that, it may be difficult going forward to get evidence in affidavit format. But if a person can do that, it's probably a good idea to do that. And if they can't provide evidence in affidavit format, it's probably not a bad idea to explain that in the application, to explain what impediments the person faced in getting an affidavit sworn in front of a lawyer or notary public. So I'd like to provide a couple of resources for people in terms of the applications themselves. These links, and by the way, I'll link to these, the video that's posted on YouTube. I'll link to these in the video description as well. But the one link deals with humanitarian and compassionate grounds applications. That's off the government website. And the other link deals with temporary resident permit applications. Related to COVID-19, there are some good resources on the internet. Just a couple that I've found. There's a website that has it's the Worldometer that has stats on COVID-19 around the world, and that could be extremely helpful if you're making humanitarian arguments based on hardship or kind of the medical situation in your home country. So that sort of information might be helpful to you. Likewise, the World Health Organization has a site devoted to COVID-19, so I've linked to that here. Now, in most cases, if you're doing a TRP or an H&C application, you should be talking about conditions in your home country. And there are some resources that oftentimes provide credible information that can be useful. The Immigration Refugee Board has something called national documentation packages. So it's an online archived store of information about different countries. So you can look up information about, for example, what the situation is in Pakistan, for example, or any other country. Likewise, the Government of Canada has travel advisories, and those are probably worth noting in a humanitarian application or in a temporary resident permit application. If you want to stay here on a temporary resident or a temporary basis, for example, it might be worth noting that the government's recommending against all travel to that particular country, if in fact that's the case on the travel advisory. So the travel advisory site is worth checking out. The Central Intelligence Agency in the United States has a website that has information about countries all over the world. They have economic information, they have political information about the legal systems of these countries. So oftentimes that can be a good source of credible information on country conditions for pretty much any country around the world. Now I'm going to open it up to questions. I haven't seen Marcella. Oh, okay. Here I'm looking at the stream right now. Marcella has a question. Okay. I recently received my closed work permit under an LMIA for 2 years. But at the moment and under the current COVID-19 situation, there's no work I can go back to. It's a hospitality position in Alberta. Does that mean I'm just going to lose the indefinite amount of months of my work permit? Is there anything I can do about that? I hate to say it, Marcella, but probably not. If you're on an LMI-based work permit, that's great, but unless unless your employer starts up your work again, you won't really be able to benefit from that. You can't use the closed work permit for work in any other occupation or for any other employer. It just has to be for your current employer. One thing you might want to do is see if you can find another work permit with another employer. So maybe someone else has an LMIA. Maybe you could apply for another type of work permit. In theory, you could even submit a TRP application or an application under significant benefit if you have some skills that might be needed during the COVID-19 pandemic, for example. Okay. Maxwell is waiting for his BC PNP nomination, and his application for a work permit was refused as he didn't have his nomination to support the work permit application. And he's currently out of status. Is he still eligible to receive the CERB? That's a good question, Maxwell. My suspicion is probably not. For people who are currently out of status, I don't think they can receive EI, and I don't think they can receive the CERB. I'm not 100% sure about that. Mark Holthe did write an article recently on EI entitlements. I linked to that in the webinar I did last week, but I'll try to link to get to that in the video description for the webinar for this week as well. But no, my thinking is that you're probably not eligible for the CERB if your work permit has expired. You may want to seriously consider two options for you. If you're still within 90 days of your work permit expiring, you might want to apply for restoration, especially if you get a nomination certificate in the near future. Another option for you is to apply for a temporary resident permit and attach that to a work permit application. Elia indicated due to sanitary situations, it's very difficult to hire a lawyer to apply under humanitarian and compassionate considerations, and that's a very complex type of application. Do you recommend to apply by ourselves? It's a very good question, Elia. No, in most cases, I wouldn't recommend that you apply by yourselves. Humanitarian applications usually are a fair bit of work, and they, you have a much better likelihood of success if you use someone like a lawyer. As I mentioned last week, I usually recommend that people use immigration lawyers rather than immigration consultants, because immigration lawyers tend to be better regulated, and they also, there are fewer problems with the profession. Let me put it that way. There are a lot of complaints against immigration consultants. A lot of immigration consultants in recent years have some have basically even been engaging in human trafficking. Others have been engaging in types of fraud. There was an immigration law consultant in Edmonton who recently had his office raided by the RCMP, and this sort of thing happens routinely with immigration consultants. I think the vast majority of consultants are good and honest people, but there's a significant chunk of that profession that's rotten to the core. Let me put it that way. So I'd recommend getting a lawyer, and in most cases, you don't have to go to the lawyer's office. You could have meetings by Skype. You could email documents to the lawyer. The lawyer could email forms to you. So face-to-face interactions probably aren't necessary for the most part. Let's see if I've got any other questions. Let's see. I'm not seeing anything else on my stream. Gonna try to refresh. I think that's it basically. So I'd like to thank the Calgary Catholic Immigration Society for giving me the idea to do this webinar series and for promoting the initial webinar. I'd also like to thank my articling student, Sunny Liu, Doctorate of Jurisprudence, who's a graduate of the University of Calgary Law School and is soon to be a full-fledged lawyer. I think she's going to make an excellent immigration lawyer. And I'd like to thank you for watching this webinar. And if you have any ideas for future webinars, please reach out to me, let me know what you'd like to have discussed. I'm planning on making these a weekly occurrence. So, if Wednesday at 10 is a good time for you, please let me know. If it's not a good time for you, please let me know that. And I'll be putting all these videos up on YouTube. They'll be archived there where people can view them at any time. So So feel free to check out those videos on YouTube. Feel free to share them with people you think might benefit from them. So thank you for watching.